Good morning, everyone. It's Monday, November 19th, and we are live from Mission Control Houston in the International Space Station Flight Control Room with a live view of the Cygnus resupply craft. And this morning, we're giving you live coverage of the berthing of Northrop Grumman's Cygnus resupply craft to the International Space Station. The space station currently off the coast of Uruguay, flying 261 statute miles above the Earth. In the International Space Station Flight Control Room in Houston, we have our flight director today, Anthony Varia, in communication with all of the flight controllers on the ground here in Houston. To his right, we have Capcom, that's capsule communicator Tamara York, speaking with the crew and relaying messages between them and the flight control room here. The visiting vehicle officer for today is Tom Castleberry. He's keeping tabs on the Cygnus spacecraft and is communicating its status with mission controllers here, as well as flight controllers in Dulles, Virginia, on the Northrop Grumman Cygnus flight control team. The Northrop Grumman mission director this morning is Paul Brower. We've been following Cygnus since it was captured this morning by NASA astronaut Serena Auñón-Chancellor and European Space Agency astronaut Alexander Gerst. It was captured at 4:28 a.m. Central Time, and following that, controls of the robotic arm were handed over to robotics officers on the ground. Over the next several minutes, we'll see Cygnus move closer to the International Space Station and the common berthing mechanism on the Unity module of the space station on the Earth-facing side. You can see Cygnus moving slowly now on the left and the space station on the right, with that common berthing mechanism in the middle of the screen. As we mentioned, we'll continue watching as Cygnus moves closer to that common berthing mechanism controlled by robotics controllers on the ground. And once it reaches just a few centimeters away from the capture point, we will hold, and the flight control team will do a series of checks to make sure that the Cygnus spacecraft and the International Space Station are ready to berth. After that, the Cygnus spacecraft will be connected to the International Space Station and secured through a series of locks and latches to make sure it is held tight. Cygnus today is bringing about 7,385 pounds of supplies, science investigations, and more to the International Space Station. About 2,515 pounds of what's on board are crew supplies. That's food, clothing, and other perishable items for the crew, including some special treats today like ice cream. We also have about 2,300 pounds of science investigations. Additionally, on board today, we have about 253 pounds of computer resources, and that includes some new laptops to replace those that are now outdated but being used on the space station. At several points throughout the capture or the berthing process this morning, we'll see that robotic arm hold, which it is currently in a hold position at the moment as flight controllers continue to make checks on the vehicle and checks on the International Space Station to ensure everything is running smoothly. Got a great view here of not only the Cygnus resupply craft, sort of in the middle of the screen at the end of the cannon arm 2, but also to the left of the screen, the Soyuz crew capsule. The space station can actually hold up to 6 vehicles at once. Currently, the Soyuz crew capsule is docked with the station. Today, we're welcoming the Cygnus, and yesterday we brought on board the Progress 71P Russian resupply craft. And once again, we can see that Canadarm2 in motion, moving the Cygnus resupply craft closer to the International Space Station. And this is the live view from the common berthing mechanism, now aligning with the Cygnus resupply craft. As you can see here, there are a series of bolts that will need to be secured in place to make sure Cygnus is properly attached to the common berthing mechanism on the Unity module. And those 16 bolts, once driven, will be our sign of second stage capture. We're now in another hold with that robotic arm. We'll start seeing it slow down as we perfect the location of the Cygnus resupply craft and bring it closer to the common berthing mechanism. Currently on board the International Space Station are NASA astronaut Serena Auñón-Chancellor, European Space Agency astronaut Alexander Gerst, and Roscosmos cosmonaut Sergei Prokopyev. Alex is currently the commander of the International Space Station, and he previously spent 6 months aboard in 2014. This crew arrived on June 6th this year and are scheduled to depart the space station on December 19th.
Station Houston, no response required. Exercise constraint begins now.
And you just heard that call from Capcom Tamara York to the International Space Station, informing the crew that they are currently under an exercise constraint, asking them to not exercise or use any of the exercise equipment while the berthing process is taking place. Alex and Serena actually just completed their exercise for the day, and this restraint comes at a time to allow the Cygnus resupply craft to easily dock with the space station without concern of any vibrations that come with the use of the exercise equipment on board. Robotics controllers on the ground now using that Canadarm2 to once again continue bringing that Cygnus resupply craft closer to the International Space Station. And this time, those robotics controllers plan on using this robotic arm for the next few minutes to continue to bring the craft closer until one more hold and some final checks before berthing Cygnus to the International Space Station. Again, there are two stages of berthing. First stage, which is a series of locks, and then second stage, which is a series of bolts. So 16 bolts that will drive to secure Cygnus to the International Space Station. You can see it slowly moving toward the common berthing mechanism on the Unity module on the Earth-facing side of the space station. We're now at the holding position, and you can see those latches getting ready to receive the Cygnus resupply craft. A great view of that Cygnus resupply craft and the common berthing mechanism as we are in a hold right now while the team does some final checks preparing Cygnus to berth with the International Space Station. Our video feeds are currently in a handover. The space station in communication with the TDRS system, that's the Tracking and Data Relay Satellite System. And this happens periodically as the station hands over from one satellite to the next. All handovers being tracked, and will regain video communications shortly. Once the Cygnus resupply craft is attached to the International Space Station, the crew will then enter later on and donning their protective equipment like goggles and masks to make sure, just in case anything has shifted around during flight, they're not affected by that. They'll begin to unload the contents of the Cygnus resupply craft, that being about 7,385 pounds of cargo. The Canadarm2 in motion once again to continue to reposition that Cygnus resupply craft to be berthed to the common berthing mechanism aboard the Unity module on the International Space Station. Cygnus is currently in a hold once again. The Canadarm2 holding as the robotics controllers fine-tune the movements slowly and deliberately, making sure that Cygnus is perfectly aligned with the common birthing mechanism. That Canadarm2 now in motion once again, bringing Cygnus closer to the International Space Station. All operations currently being controlled from the ground by robotics controllers. We can see Cygnus slowly moving in toward the common birthing mechanism, preparing for first and second stage capture. First being the series of latches that you see, and second being a series of 16 bolts. Ready to latch, looking good. Cygnus is now currently in its birthing position and ready for first and second stage capture to begin soon. The Canadarm2 now braked as the Cygnus is within the common birthing mechanism. And that series of locks and latches getting ready. Each of the Cygnus spacecraft are named after influential individuals in the world of spaceflight, and the specific craft you see today is dedicated to John Young, former NASA astronaut. Young logged 835 hours in space throughout 6 space missions. As a member of NASA's second astronaut class, he was on the Gemini 3 flight testing the Gemini spacecraft and also flew on Gemini 10. He later served as the command module pilot on Apollo 10 and then later walked on the moon in Apollo 16. John Young also flew on the maiden flight of the space shuttle in 1981 with Bob Crippen on STS-1 and completed his time as a NASA astronaut with STS-9. And just received the green light for first stage capture. That first stage will be a series of 4 latches. And those are now in progress, securing Cygnus to the International Space Station. We've just received confirmation of first stage capture. Robotics controllers will now control the arm to go limp for the remainder of the birthing process. And arm is now confirmed limp. This sets up the second stage capture to begin shortly. The International Space Station is currently crossing the terminator line, meaning it is moving from an orbital daytime into an orbital nighttime, coming up on the Bay of Bengal. We'll start seeing our views of the Earth and of the spacecraft get a little bit darker as we cross into this orbital nighttime. Even in orbital nighttime, all the remaining procedures can be completed with the second stage capture coming up next, which will be the firing of 16 bolts to further secure Cygnus to the International Space Station.
Well.
You can see Cygnus slowly moving as it is further attached to the space station. After first stage capture, which are the series of those latches, the Cygnus resupply craft is pulled into the common berthing mechanism through use of those latches. And next will be second stage capture with the bolts. A great view of Cygnus just outside the Unity module of the International Space Station, 250 statute miles above the Earth, crossing over the Bay of Bengal. We're in another satellite handover as the space station switches over through the tracking and data relay satellite system. This is currently a live view of Mission Control Houston and the International Space Station Flight Control Room, where flight controllers are monitoring both the International Space Station and the Cygnus spacecraft as it berths today to the Unity module. This morning we've seen robotics controllers use the Canadarm2 to bring the Cygnus spacecraft closer and into the common berthing mechanism of the International Space Station. There's been a confirmed solid first stage capture. The space station has crossed over into an orbital nighttime and is flying over Myanmar. We are now awaiting that second stage, where the 16 bolts will further secure the Cygnus spacecraft to the International Space Station. And those bolts are currently driving. Once tightened and complete, the berthing of Cygnus will be complete to the International Space Station. It's an exciting month for the International Space Station, as tomorrow, November 20th, marks 20 years since the first Element launch, and that's Zarya, or translating to sunrise, launched atop a Russian Proton rocket. Today, Cygnus is berthing with the Unity module on the International Space Station. Unity was the second module to launch into space and mate with Zarya, Unity being the first U.S. module. We've just received confirmation that all 16 bolts are now tightened and secured with the Cygnus resupply craft. Berthing occurred at 6:31 a.m. Central Time, while the space station was 250 statute miles above eastern China.
Station Houston on 2, no response required. We are done with exercise constraints.
As you've heard, exercise constraints are lifted and the crew can resume their daily activities. This also completes Cygnus' journey for the day, which began on November 17th at 3:01 a.m. Central Time. Cygnus launched from Wallops Flight Facility in Virginia from the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport Pad 0A atop an Antares rocket. The launch was postponed from November 15th to the 17th as teams waited on better weather conditions. And with clear skies and temperatures at about 38 degrees Fahrenheit, Cygnus began its journey to the International Space Station. Cygnus made about a 9-minute ascent to orbit with those first stage engines firing liquid oxygen and kerosene. After the solid second stage cutoff, solar arrays unfurled and Cygnus continued its journey to the International Space Station. Cygnus was captured at 4:28 a.m. Central Time this morning by NASA astronaut Serena Auñón-Chancellor alongside European astronaut Alexander Gerst using the Canadarm2 and the Cupola module. After grapple of the spacecraft, control of the robotic arm was handed over to teams on the ground who have brought the spacecraft to the station and readied it for berthing, which took place on the Earth-facing side of the space station's Unity module this morning at 6:31 a.m. Central Time. Cygnus will stay attached to the International Space Station until February 2019, when it will be loaded with trash and other crew disposables and will disintegrate in the Earth's atmosphere high above the planet. But before that, the crew will begin to enter the Cygnus resupply craft later today and begin unloading its contents. And that's over 7,385 pounds of cargo. Thank you for joining us on our live coverage of Cygnus from launch to grapple to berthing. That wraps up our live coverage for today. This is Mission Control, Houston.